Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this ongoing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Monday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We are moving rapidly through the month of September. Today we are midway through. Today is the 15th day of a 30-day month. September 15th in the year 2014, and the temperature is beginning to kind of give us hints that that summer is a memory, and we are moving into cooler weather. I was telling Bob before we went on the air today, Bob Kincaid, that I wore a jacket to class this morning. That's the beginning. We know what's coming. It'll, as Bob said, it'll be jackets and boots and scarves and gloves and everything else before we even know it. I hope that your weekend was as enjoyable as mine, and I welcome you for your willingness to give us a portion of your time on this Monday. It is again a pleasure and an honor for me to be with you today, and the fact that you tune in I appreciate that so much. I really do. I take your willingness to devote your valuable time to this program and to the Head On Radio Network generally. We take that very seriously. I know Bob Kincaid and his folks do. I do as well. I appreciate so much the support, the emails you send, and the support you give the network and you give me personally, and I thank you for that. I've gotten a number of emails over the last 4 or 5 days from listeners that just wanting to reassure me, I guess, that you are out there, that there are real people, live people out there, and I know that a number of people are picking up the programs through the archives or on podcast or whatever, and I appreciate that as well. We do invite you to participate actively in our program. We would love to hear from you. It's obvious that one of the things we need more than anything else in our society today is increased conversation, dialogue. We not only need more talk, we actually need a little bit more listening, I think. The phone number that you can call to get on the air with your ideas or your concerns or suggestions or recommendations about the issues that we're dealing with here at the Virtual Center. The area code is 304 and the number is 574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. If you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, BRIEN, 906@gmail.com. And again, the phone number, 304-574-8178. Let me open the program first by acknowledging an email that I received from Betsy in Texas. And I wanted to, I promised her when I responded, I thanked her for the link. And I kind of suggested that I would react to the particular link that she sent me. Betsy has come across a link for a program of American history, a series of American history programs entitled Crash Course. And they are a series of relatively short videos on key topics that take us chronologically through the field of American history. For example, the first one deals with the black legend and the cultural clash between the Spanish in Central and South America and the native population that existed there. So basically, the first program, which is about 11 minutes, the video, deals with the internal, innate cultural differences, if you will, between a West that is in the process of modernizing and a traditional agrarian, in some cases hunter-gathering in North America, but in Central America, a very sophisticated, highly organized society of Native Americans in the person of groups that we know as the Incas, the Aztecs, the Mayans, and of course this refers to these incredibly sophisticated civilizations that existed in the New World when the Spanish arrived. And of course the very term Black Legend is the label associated with the Spanish incursion into the West, because within a century after the Spanish arrived in Central and South America, these civilizations were pretty much destroyed. The populations, millions of people, were decimated, not only through military reasons, but also through the diseases that Westerners brought here and whatever. The fact of the matter is, very well-organized, highly sophisticated cultures and civilizations oftentimes were lost in the clash. Anyway, I watched the video, and then I watched a couple more. The link that Betsy sent me, and if you go online and look up crash courses, I think you will probably find the link to this particular program. The 8th program in the series is a 13-minute video on the Articles of Confederation, the writing and ratification of the Constitution, and the establishment of the American Republic under the Constitution in the 1790s, primarily looking at the Washington administration. I looked at these, and Betsy had asked me from what I thought, and she mentioned that one of her teaching colleagues in middle school, was very taken with these and was using them in class and found them to be very helpful. And let me try to be, and I just looked at a few of them, the couple, one last night and a couple this morning, and these are just observations that I would make. First of all, they are extremely entertaining. It would be well worth anyone's while to look at these and to appreciate the host. The host is a young gentleman sitting in front of an Apple computer, a Mac computer, who is extremely articulate, extremely engaging in his presentation. And basically, there's no question, after looking at a couple of these, that the overall purpose of these videos is to interest and hopefully maybe even a little bit excite students who probably don't see any purpose or any sense to their study, the required study of American history. And so basically, these presentations by this host are extremely warm. They're extremely affectionate. They aren't at all hostile. This presenter is not in any way looking down upon those who are looking at the videos. And it's very, very catchy. It's very, very fast. It is very light on content. Beyond being light on content, it is almost devoid of substance and depth. And I don't necessarily mean this as a total criticism, because there are comments which suggest very important insights. And clearly, there's an effort to make this material from the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries relevant to youngsters in today's world in the 21st century. And that's not easy. And I think that the presentation here is designed as a hook. What I mean by a hook is that these presentations are clearly intended and produced to attract attention, to get youngsters interested in the particular subject at hand. What I would say to Betsy is that as a hook, which would mean a way to introduce the subject and get people involved in it before one begins to actually examine the issues associated with that particular topic, it seems to me quite appropriate and indeed quite enticing. But as a substitute for traditional teaching, no. The issue is, while they are very entertaining, they really require nothing on the part of the audience. They are designed to entertain, and they do entertain. And of course, I'm not your run-of-the-mill average observer. I'm not the person randomly selected off the street. My field is American history. I'm very, very interested in the subject. I have what I believe is a passionate commitment to the value of the study of this subject in terms of rounding out the educational system and participating, at least in part, in the humanization of America's young people. I believe, I believe that education teaches us how to be human. And I think part of that humanity is the ability to relate and interact and understand and be sensitive to and appreciate and walk in the shoes of, if you will, others. Not others necessarily who are equal to us and the same as we are, but others who maybe haven't had the advantages and the breaks that we've had. It seems to me that the kind of humanity and concern for our neighbor, if you will, that I think is part and parcel of the key factors associated with a good education. None of that is present here. As a hook, as a way to spark interest and get people interested in something that follows, I think these videos are very effective and very good. But substantive education doesn't begin to happen until students begin to do something. And as far as they go, these videos don't ask or require students to do anything except listen and hopefully be entertained. And as I say, in some ways they are extremely entertaining. They are very quick and they skim very lightly over key pieces of information. So basically, the theme of these presentations is not content, and that I appreciate. It is overall meaning and the connections and how all of these isolated pieces of information connect together and fit into something that makes sense and something that has at least a modicum of relevance. In that, I think these videos are quite successful. One of the lines that particularly stuck in my mind with the one on the Articles of Confederation was the way the articles were presented, and the way they were presented as follows. As a government, the Articles of Confederation, in a word, was awful. In 2 words, it was not good. And then very quickly, the person doing the speaking touched on some of the key issues, some of the key powers under the articles that government didn't have. The power to raise an army, the power to tax, the power to regulate trade, etc. And he made specific focus on the absence of the power to tax. And then the comment was, overall, the Articles of Confederation was a government that didn't have the power to govern. Like like non-alcoholic beer, when push comes to shove, it's useless. And I found that entertaining, that analogy. between the Articles of Confederation and non-alcoholic beer. On the other hand, the more I thought about it, the more I began to realize that this kind of gives the impression of a light, flippant, not very serious effort to try to explain overall connections and overall meanings without forcing kids to get into the content and the substance of the material or of the discipline itself. So, in and of themselves, if this is all there is, these really aren't very, very helpful. But if one sees them as a hook and a way to build interest, and then one can go back and construct substantive lessons with activities on the part of the students. In other words, as long as the presenter is making the connections, education of those watching the video doesn't happen. It's only when the people watching, the students, begin to make the connections that things begin to happen. So consequently, any educational experience worthy of the name must engage students in some way, in some form. It must require students to do something. And until that happens, the educational value of the overall enterprise must remain limited. That again, I don't in any way intend to demean in any way the quality or the value of these presentations. The production is good. The speed is incredible. And what I mean is the very general nature in which information is brought together and pieced together and explained is very, very good. But if there's not some follow-up, some way to require students to engage this material and engage this information, then chances are they may remember that the person on the tape was very entertaining, but chances are they won't remember much else. So again, as an aid to learning, I think they have tremendous potential. As a substitute for learning, not good. Not nearly enough. I hope that helps. I don't want to be negative, and I don't want to be overly negative at all, because I did enjoy the 3 videos I watched. I also received an email over the weekend from one of our listeners, Jack. And Jack made me, how ironic that both of these messages are in the same vein. Jack sent me the link to one of the so-called MOOCs, massive online courses that are available in higher education, most of them at the graduate level. And he made me aware, he sent me a link to a course offered by Coursera, Coursera, which is producing a number of these massive online video courses. This particular one is on independence and the philosophical origins of the Republic. It's very, very close to the overall theme that we are pursuing here at the Virtual Center. And Jack was very, very interested that at least I know about the availability of this course. If you look it up online, there's a very brief, and I mean very brief, it's probably 3 or 4 or 5 minutes long, introduction to the course by the instructor, who is a history professor at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. The University of Pennsylvania, of course, is one of our Ivy League schools. It's one of the best universities in the world. Consequently, and needless to say, the course itself is pretty high-powered. It's it's based on the philosophies that went into both independence, the development of the Republic, and the creation of the Constitution of the United States. And there's an endless list of philosophers touched upon and political thinkers touched upon, from Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and Tacitus and Sallust in Rome, to many of the Scottish philosophers that we looked at, Hume and Adam Smith and Ferguson and Hutcheson and all the rest of them, as well as, of course, John Locke and Montesquieu and Rousseau and many of the so-called Enlightenment philosophers, political philosophers. It's obviously a quite substantive and very valuable experience, this particular course. I looked at the syllabus. It's comprised of modules, of units. And the units are organized around the issues of individual freedom, the conflict between equality and freedom or liberty, the inconsistency and the innate contradiction between liberty and equality. It touches on a number of these themes. It talks about the issue of prisons and the right of societies to apply capital punishment and to incarcerate large members of their own population in prisons. It talks about the philosophical origins of this. Very, very substantive. I would, if you have time and if you have the inclination, and let me suggest to you, this is free. The main commitment is one of time. According to the syllabus, the class runs for, I believe it's 2 months in length. It requires 7 to 10 hours a week of work, and I'm assuming that means reading the particular philosophies associated with the class. And it includes a number of videos, lectures presented by the instructor. So I think the quality of this would be well worth the time for those that might be interested in it. I want to thank Jack for that link, as I want to thank Betsy for the link on the crash course series that we just spoke about. We are at 23 minutes after the hour, and I wanted to introduce our program, the substance of our program today. And what that basically requires is that we go back and touch base, if you will, with Stephen Breyer's decision in the case of National Labor Relations Board versus Noel Canning, the case that we looked at in our last time together 5 days ago, or I believe it was last Wednesday. And if you remember, we spent the bulk of the program going through the majority decision written by Stephen Breyer in this case. And basically, the case revolved around the authority of the president to make recess appointments during the times when the Senate is not in session. Specifically, the Constitution of the United States in Article 2 gives the president the authority to make appointments with the advice and consent of the Senate. That's Article 2, Section 2. The very next paragraph reads as follows. The President shall have power to fill up all vacancies that may happen during the recess of the Senate, by granting commissions which shall expire at the end of their next session, unquote. The case of National Labor Relations Board versus Noel Canning focused on 3 members of a 5-member National Labor Relations Board that were appointed by President Obama during a recess and of the Senate, a time when the Senate was not in session. And the issue of the case is whether, in fact, the appointments are legitimate or whether these appointments violate the Constitution of the United States because they constitute an excess of power in the hands of the executive. The details of the case and the reason that the case is worded the way it is, the clause, the recess appointments clause in the Constitution is worded as the way it is. Let me quote Justice Breyer. To prevent the President's recess appointment power from nullifying the Senate's role in the appointment process, the Constitution cabins that power in 2 significant ways. First, it may be exercised only during the recess of the Senate. That is, the intermission between 2 formal legislative sessions. Second, it may be used to fill only those vacancies that happen during the recess. That is, offices that become vacant during the intermission. This is, I'm reading specifically from a dissenting, actually it's a concurring opinion of Justice Scalia, because the overall decision of the court, written by Justice Breyer, Stephen Breyer, is 9-0. And in a 9-0 vote, the court rules that President Obama did indeed exceed the powers granted him under the Recess Appointments Clause because he made appointments at a time when it was possible for him to receive the advice and consent of the Senate. Specifically, and this is Justice Breyer, the President made the appointments at issue on January 4th, 2012. At that time, the Senate was in recess, pursuant to a December 17th resolution providing for a series of brief recesses punctuated by pro forma sessions with no business transacted every Tuesday and Friday through the 20th of January 2012. In other words, while the Senate was not meeting in session, it was holding these pro forma sessions 2 days a week, Tuesdays and Fridays, during the so-called recess, in order that there would not be a formal recess, thereby denying the President the power to make these appointments to the National Labor Relations Board. The Senate was going home over the holidays, December 17th to January 20th. It did not want to meet through the holidays, through the Christmas holidays, obviously. On the other hand, they did not want the President to be able to fill these particular seats on the National Labor Relations Board. Therefore, they set up these pro forma 2-day-a-week meetings where no business would be transacted, but that the Senate would, technically speaking, not be in recess, which would mean if the Senate was not in recess, it was in session. Consequently, the President could not make recess appointments. The court ruled in this decision 9-0 that the President had indeed overstepped his legitimate executive authority under the Resource Appointments Clause of the Constitution of the United States. And the reasoning of the court in the 9-0 decision was that when the Senate says it is in session, then we have no way, or we have no cause to claim that it's not. In other words, the overall reasoning of the court came down to the fact that because the Senate ruled that it was in session, therefore it was in session, therefore the Recess Appointments Clause was not operative, and therefore President Obama has exceeded his legitimate authority by making these appointments. That was a unanimous decision of the court, 9-0. However, there were two other questions before the court in this case. The first question revolved around what the term recess of the Senate means. Did the phrase recess only refer to the period between formal sessions of the Senate, or could it include intra-session recesses, like a summer recess in the middle of a session? Is the issue at hand here the technical language of the Constitution, which says the recess of the Senate, or is the real issue whenever the Senate is not available for advice and consent, the President then is empowered to make recess appointments under the Recess Appointments Clause? That's the first question. The second question focuses on the idea of vacancies that happen during such recesses. Specifically, does the phrase refer only to recesses that occur during, vacancies that occur during a recess, or would it occur to a vacancy that included during the session but extended into the recess? On those two questions, the court was not unanimous. Rather, the court split 5-4 on those two sessions. And Justice Breyer's overall decision in this case spoke for the 9-0 unanimous vote on the illegality of the Obama appointments to the National Labor Relations Board. But it also spoke to the 5-4 majority against a minority led by Justice Antonin Scalia and his conservative followers, Justices Roberts and Alito and Clarence Thomas. And whereas the decision is interpreted as a defeat for President Obama because he lost these appointments, the fact of the matter is the reasoning and the overall implications on the first two questions, which Obama won, actually are more meaningful than the overall decision in the case itself. And so Justice Scalia writes a scathing criticism of the majority of the court on these first two questions, even though he goes along with the 9-0 ruling against these particular appointments. In fact, Justice Scalia says, and I'm reading specifically from his concurring opinion, and the reason it's a concurring opinion is because he goes along with the major one. He dissents from the two secondary issues. This is what Justice Scalia says. The court's decision transforms the recess appointment power from a tool carefully designed to fill a narrow and specific need into a weapon to be wielded by future presidents against future senates. To reach that result, the majority casts aside the plain original meaning of the constitutional text in deference to late arising historical practices that are ambiguous at best. The majority's insistence on deferring to the executive's untenably broad interpretation of the power is in clear conflict with our precedent and forebodes a diminution of this court's role in controversies involving the separation of powers and the structure of government. I concur in the judgment only. So Justice Scalia takes issue with the first two questions in this particular case. And the fact matter is, as pointed out by Linda Greenhouse in an article in the New York Times on this case, on this decision, actually, the two questions decided by the 5-4 majority turn out to be much more of a victory for the executive power, for the president's power, than the third one, which is a defeat of these specific three appointments. Because Linda Greenhouse points out quite accurately that if the majority had gone along with Justice Scalia rather than Justice Breyer, the result would have been the effective elimination of the recess appointments power entirely from the Constitution of the United States. It would have so limited the president's ability to make recess appointments that it would have effectively destroyed the power and weakened the power of future presidents. The fact that Justice Breyer and his 5-4 majority were able to win out on this decision means that in the long term, the majority decision in these two questions becomes far more important than the 9-0 unanimous decision against the three specific appointments that the president makes. I want to share with you from Justice Breyer a couple. We looked at these in much more detail last Wednesday. So this is in the context of a review, because I think after nearly a week, it really, in order to look at Justice Scalia's concurring opinion, it's going to be necessary to go back over and review some of the things that Justice Breyer said in the majority decision. In the majority decision, Justice Breyer says, and I quote, "The Federalist Papers make clear that the founders intended this method of appointment, requiring Senate approval, to be the norm, at least for principal officers. Alexander Hamilton wrote in Federalist number 76, that the Constitution vests the power of nomination in the President alone because, quote, one man of discernment is better fitted to analyze and estimate the peculiar qualities adapted to particular offices than a body of men of equal or perhaps even of superior discernment." In other words, Hamilton's argument is that the founders, this is in Federalist number 76, the founders' decision to give the president the power to make the appointments is because this one office, this one person, is much more qualified and much more capable of making intelligent, shrewd appointments than as a committee. You know, when you try to have a committee, a group, if the Senate had to make the appointments, how would you ever get all the members of the Senate to agree on anything? So the efficiency of the government seems to mandate that the president ought to have the appointment power. But, and this is an important but, Hamilton believes that the wisdom of the Senate is valuable to this process. Hamilton goes on in Federalist number 76 and says at the same time the need to secure the Senate approval provides an excellent check upon the spirit of favoritism in the president and would tend greatly to prevent the appointment of unfit characters from state prejudice, from family connection, from personal attachment, or from a view to popularity. In other words, by requiring Senate approval, advice and consent of the Senate, it ensures that the president's appointments are going to be legitimate ones and not appointment made on favors or who they are or family connections or party affiliation or anything else. So therefore, Hamilton is saying in Federalist number 76, the founders were able to achieve two positives in this appointment. They gave the right person the power to make the appointment, and by requiring the Senate to go along with it, they ensured that only the best appointments would make it through Senate approval. Hamilton further explained, this is in Federalist 67, that the ordinary power of appointment is confided to the President and Senate jointly and can therefore only be exercised during sessions of the Senate. But Hamilton goes on. But as it would have been improper to oblige this body to be continually in session for the appointment of officers, and as vacancies might happen during their recess, which it might be necessary for the public service to fill without delay, the succeeding clause, the recess appointments clause, is evidently intended to authorize the President singly to make temporary appointments. In 67, Federalist 67, Hamilton is acknowledging a point that the majority, the 5-4 majority, agrees with, that the recess appointments clause is in part, at least, a way to deal with the substantive differences between the Senate on the one hand and the executive branch, the presidency, on the other. Specifically, the court ruled, under Justice Breyer's pen, he wrote the majority opinion, that there's a basic difference here. The executive branch doesn't go on recess. Government must be in session all the time. But on the other hand, it would be ridiculous to expect the Senate to never go out of session, to never go back to the district or touch base with the states that sent them. Consequently, the recess appointments clause is primarily designed to keep government running, even though the Senate might not be able at the moment to provide advice and consent. So that's basically the decision that Justice Breyer and the majority, the 5-4 majority, made in this particular case. In the midst of this decision, which is 40 pages long, Justice Breyer goes back again to the intent of the founders. And he says the following: "We are aware of, but we are not persuaded by, three important arguments to the contrary. First, some argue that the founders would likely have intended the clause to apply only to intersession recesses, for they hardly knew any other. Up until the early years of the nation's history, the Senate had two regular sessions with a planned break, recess in between. And if you look literally at the Constitution, then you would say, and this is what Justice Scalia says, that the recess appointment can only be made during that recess. And the Breyer decision, majority decision, acknowledges that point. And Justice Breyer continues, "From the founding until the Civil War, intersession recesses were the only kind of significant recesses that Congress took. The problem with this argument, however," Breyer says, "is that it does not fully describe the relevant founding intent." Now we are into the substance here. Namely, the relevant founding intent. What the founders had in mind when they wrote the Constitution this way. The problem with this argument, Breyer says, is that it does not fully describe the relevant founding intent. The question is not, did the founders at the time think about intra-session recesses? Perhaps they didn't. The real question is, Breyer said, did the founders intend to restrict the scope of the clause to the form of congressional recess then prevalent, or did they intend to a broader scope, permitting the clause to apply, where appropriate, to somewhat changed circumstances? Breyer says that if you focus on the text, on the language of the Constitution, it implies that the founders intended to limit recess appointments to the official recess between sessions. But Justice Breyer's argument is that the whole history of the relations between the President and the Senate suggests that that was not the intent of the founders at all. The founders knew they were writing a document designed to apply to ever-changing circumstances over centuries, says Justice Breyer. After all, a constitution is intended to endure for ages to come and must adapt itself to a future that can only be seen dimly, if at all. That's a quote directly from Justice Marshall's decision in McCulloch versus Maryland. We therefore think that the framers likely did intend the clause to apply to a new circumstance that so clearly falls within its essential purposes, where doing so is consistent with the clause's language. What the Breyer majority is asserting here, against the efforts of Justice Scalia to argue the opposite, is the founders intended that the Constitution be adaptable and flexible in order to meet changing circumstances, rather than be locked into a particular definition of when the Senate recesses occurred. That was the practice in the 18th and early 19th centuries. What Justice Breyer, in effect, and the majority are arguing here is that the founders intended a document that must continually adapt to changing circumstances. i.e., the living Constitution. And the reason that Justice Breyer pays so much attention in this majority decision to the opinion written by Justice Scalia is that if the majority went along with Justice Scalia, the powers of appointment on the part of the president would be so limited to so few situations as to become effectively inoperable in the Constitution of the United States. And there's one additional quote from the Breyer majority decision that I'd like to share. We went through a lot of the detail last time, and I don't want to go back over that. That would be just repeating the same program we did last Wednesday, and that's on archives. You can tune in that. In fact, I recommend that you do. This is an important intellectual exercise that the Supreme Court is going through. At the end of his decision, on the very final page of a 41-page decision, Justice Breyer says the following. The Recess Appointment Clause responds to a structural difference between the executive and legislative branches. The executive branch is perpetually in operation, while the legislature only acts in intervals separated by recesses. The purpose of the clause is to allow the executive to continue operating while the Senate is unavailable. We believe that the clause's text, standing alone, is ambiguous. It does not resolve whether the president may make appointments during intra-session recesses or whether he may fill pre-recess vacancies. But the broader reading better serves the clause's structural function. Moreover, that broader reading is reinforced by centuries of history, which we are hesitant to disturb. We thus hold that the Constitution empowers the President to fill any existing vacancy during any recess, intra-session or intersession, of sufficient length. But Justice Breyer goes on and speaks directly to the Scalia concurring opinion. Justice Scalia would render illegitimate thousands of recess appointments reaching all the way back to the founding era. More than that, calling the clause an anachronism, which Justice Scalia does, he would basically read it out of the Constitution. He performs this act of judicial excision in the name of liberty. We fail to see how excising the Recess Appointments Clause preserves freedom. In fact, Alexander Hamilton observed in the very first Federalist paper that the vigor of government is essential to the security of liberty, unquote. And the framers included the Recess Appointments Clause to preserve the vigor of government at times when an important organ of government, the United States Senate, is in recess. Justice Scalia's interpretation of the clause would defeat the power of the clause to achieve that objective, says Justice Breyer in the majority decision. We have 5 minutes left in this, our first hour today. And I would like to use this 5 minutes to make what I believe is an important point about this entire decision and the two positions being argued, one by Justice Scalia, the other by Justice Breyer. Specifically, I would like to focus on Justice Scalia's emphasis on liberty. on freedom. Justice Breyer says at the conclusion of his decision that he doesn't see how excising the recess appointments clause from the Constitution helps to preserve freedom. Yet Justice Scalia makes the case that his opinion is in defense of preserving freedom. And then he cites Alexander Hamilton in the very first Federalist paper to the effect that the vigor of government is essential to the security of liberty, unquote. The issue here, the issue of freedom, is a vital one. It clearly is a priority for Justice Scalia. But the definition of freedom from which he operates suggests that freedom and the power of government to govern are inversely proportional to each other, i.e., that the more able government is to function, the more it directly infringes on the freedom of citizens. Contrary to that, the other side of that coin, the more you can emasculate government and make it inoperable, the more you are enhancing the freedom of the citizens, of the American people. It's very, very important that we understand that, because that goes a long way to explaining what's going on in the politics of the United States today. The efforts of the Republican minority in the Senate, and let me remind you, it is a minority, but the efforts of McConnell, of Senator McConnell, and the Senate minority during the Obama administration to demand supermajority, 60 Senate votes, is in effect rendering power in the Senate to the minority, because the majority doesn't have the two-thirds needed to override the minority. Consequently, we have the inactivity and the dysfunction that we have seen in recent years in the Congress of the United States between a House under the control of Republicans that continues to pass legislation that the Democratic majority in the Senate refuses to go along with. But on the other hand, by demanding the so-called supermajority, the 60 Senate votes to override the filibuster, the minority in the Senate has effectively taken power over the majority. And of course, with this fall's elections coming, the predictions are that the Republicans might indeed take enough seats in the Senate to become the majority there as well. Combination of a House of Representatives and Senate controlled by Republicans suggests the likelihood that President Obama's agenda for the last 2 years of his term might effectively become inoperable totally. If we think we've seen inaction coming out of Washington in the last 6 years, the prospects for the last 2 years of the second Obama administration are entirely different. But before we take a break at the top of the hour, and we are at 59 minutes after the hour, Let me make one other point about this emphasis on the part of Justice Scalia on liberty. Justice Scalia says in his concurring opinion, to prevent the Senate's recess appointment from nullifying the Senate's role in the appointment process, the Constitution cabins that power in two significant ways. First, it may be exercised only in the recess of the Senate, that means during the formal recesses between sessions. And second, that it can only be used to fill those vacancies that happen during that recess. Both these conditions, Justice Scalia says, are clear from the Constitution's text and structure. In other words, technically speaking, that's a valid argument on the, a valid interpretation of the Constitution of the United States if you focus only on the language. The point is that in emphasizing liberty as the purpose of government in the first place, Justice Scalia is putting an emphasis on the priorities of the so-called unalienable rights that Jefferson referred to in the Declaration of Independence, which I would suggest warrant serious attention. If you, as I have been overwhelmed the past week about what's happening with the National Football League in terms of spousal abuse and in recent days child abuse on the part of prominent players in the National Football League, it may suggest to you, it has to me, that the issue of liberty may not be the critical issue in today's society that Justice Scalia wants us to believe. I would suggest to you that much more significant might be the issue of humanity itself. Men who respected the personhood, not of corporations, but of women and children, would abuse neither. And it may be that the priorities of this nation have become such that we really need to reevaluate the extent to which the focus on liberty is really the most important priority in the 21st century Constitution of the United States. I would suggest to you that there is a concern I have that people's freedom from government, the right to do whatever people choose to do, has taken precedence over people's responsibility to treat each other with humanity and respect, as well as empathy and sensitivity. I would suggest that maybe we need to have a little talk with Justice Scalia and ask him that it might be time to kind of rethink his priorities a little bit. We can pursue this after the break. We are at 4 minutes after the hour. Let's pause and take a 4 or 5 minute break here at the Virtual Center, and then we'll come back and we'll complete our second hour at the Virtual Center. Please stay with us. We'll be right back.
We now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here's Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the second hour of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and civic responsibility. And I keep emphasizing that and civic responsibility because there's absolutely no question that a key part of understanding the Constitution of the United States, it seems to me, requires that we step outside the box, if you will, that is defined by the language of the Constitution itself, the text, and look at the development of the Constitution and the priorities it was intended by the framers, did I say farmers? The framers, to address. Of course, if Jefferson would say if it was done by farmers, it'd be a much better Constitution. But anyway, the issue that we've been looking at is the basis of the differences of opinion between Justices Scalia and Breyer on this particular decision, National Labor Relations Board versus Noel Canning. I invite your participation in our program. I'd really appreciate hearing your thoughts, as would, I'm sure, our other listeners. Our phone number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me one-on-one, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. If you are just joining us, welcome. We spent the bulk of the first hour looking back at the Breyer majority decision in the case of the National Labor Relations Board versus Noel Canning, which focused on the extent of the president's recess appointments powers in Article 2 of the Constitution of the United States. Specifically, the Canning case revolved around three appointments that President Obama made during a period in early January 2012 on the assumption that the Senate was in holiday recess during that period. But on looking at the evidence, the Senate, the Republican minority on the Senate, had arranged for pro forma sessions every Tuesday and Friday during that period over the holidays in order to make it appear that the Senate was still in session when in fact no business was being conducted. The purpose of that, of course, is to prevent the period over the holidays from being defined as a recess, thereby kicking in the president's power to make recess appointments. As long as the Senate remained in session, no recess occurred. And if there was no recess, then there was no justification for the president to fill the three slots on the National Labor Relations Board. And by a 9-0 decision, 9-0, the Supreme Court ruled that these appointments were indeed illegal because the president had exceeded his power by making recess appointments at a time when the Senate was still technically in session. The court's conclusion, the majority's conclusion, was that if the Senate claims that it is still in session, then it is, and the court has no right to rule otherwise. So President Obama lost his three appointments to the National Labor Relations Board. But as we've been focusing on through last Wednesday's program and in our review in our first hour today, the two other decisions associated with this case actually end up being much more significant in the long term than the three appointments in question, because they raise the issue of whether, in fact, the definition of Senate recesses will be so tightly defined, rigidly controlled, that for all practical purposes, it would eliminate the president's recess appointments power entirely. Justice Scalia, as we mentioned just prior to the end of our first hour, took issue with this in a minority decision on 2 of the 3 questions. His overall decision is a concurring decision because he went along with the 9-0 decision. But as he says in the opening of his opinion, that's the only thing in this case he goes along with. In the process of clarifying his position on why the president's recess appointments power should be limited to times when actual recesses exist and the Senate is able to provide its advice and counsel in accordance with the Constitution, Justice Scalia believes that he is imposing limits, if you will, on the president taking the recess appointments power and expanding it well beyond the meaning of the founders. And it's his rationale or his reasoning that I think we want to spend the rest of today's program on. Specifically, I'm quoting directly from Justice Antonin Scalia's concurring opinion in National Labor Relations Board versus Noel Canning. Justice Scalia says, today's majority, the 5-4 majority, and the opinion written in defense of it by Justice Breyer, today's majority disregards 2 overarching principles that ought to guide our consideration of the questions presented here. First, the Constitution's core government structuring provisions are no less critical to preserving liberty than are the later adopted provisions of the Bill of Rights. Translation: Justice Scalia is putting a premium on the preservation of individual liberty and arguing that the preservation of liberty is the Constitution's very core, the very essence of what government in this nation is all about. And that role of protecting individual liberty in the Constitution is no less important than the provisions for individual freedom adopted later in the Bill of Rights itself. Indeed, and this is a quote, indeed, so convinced were the framers that liberty of the person inheres in structure that at first they did not consider a Bill of Rights necessary, unquote. That is true. The framers did not initially include a Bill of Rights in the drafting of the Constitution of the United States. We know that. What Justice Scalia is doing is imposing a rationale on that omission, on that fact. His rationale is that, quote, so convinced were the framers that liberty of the person inheres in structure. Justice Scalia is suggesting that the number one priority of the framers was the protection and preservation of individual liberty. Those structural provisions, Scalia says, reflect the founding generation's deep conviction that checks and balances were the foundation of a structure of government that would protect liberty. It is for that reason that the claims of individuals, not of government departments, have been the principal source of judicial decisions concerning separation of powers and checks and balances. Those decisions all rest on the bedrock principle that the constitutional structure of our government is designed first and foremost not to look after the interests of the respective branches, but to protect individual liberty." Unquote. What Justice Scalia is asserting here is that the real issues in this case are the preservation of individual liberty as being the sine qua non of what the Constitution of the United States is all about. But implied in that reasoning, unspoken but implied, is his understanding or belief that the only way to promote individual liberty is to stifle government, based on the assumption that government's ability to govern damages the individual citizen's right to freedom. I would suggest to you that that is not unquestioned fact. It is the assumption which drives Justice Scalia and drives conservatives. It drives the Tea Party. It drives the Koch brothers. It drives Grover Norquist. The assumption is that every blow against government's ability to govern enhances individual freedom. But, and I go back to Justice Breyer, Alexander Hamilton, in the very first Federalist paper, made the point that the vigor of government is the basis of individual freedom, not its detriment, but rather the producer of the environment that makes freedom possible and meaningful. In the absence of government, in the absence of runaway ideas of freedom, of liberty, you have chaos. More important than that, you have the ability of the powerful to abuse the not powerful. This interpretation of the core of the government of the United States, the core of the Constitution, as the protection of individual liberty is the philosophical basis of conservative philosophy today. There's absolutely no question that liberty, individual freedom, is a critical component to an understanding of the American Republic. One need go no further than Madison's Federalist 10 to know that. Madison says to abolish people's freedom to join factions because factions have a tendency to become violent is a cure worse than the disease. It's tantamount to eliminating air because air breeds fires. There's no question that individual liberty is a priority in our constitutional system. There's no question that individual liberty is a foundational principle necessary for the evolution, for the establishment, development, and evolution of industrial capitalism. There's absolutely no question. All of this is true. But to impose 19th, 20th, and 21st century meaning back into the 18th century on the founders, I would suggest to you, goes a little bit beyond the pale. Justice Scalia is extremely critical of the majority of the Breyer decision in this particular case because Justice Breyer spends the bulk of the time, in his opinion, in his majority opinion, tracing the history of the Recess Appointments Clause throughout the nation's history in order to argue that the history of the nation suggests that the intent of the founders was not the limited, restricted view of the resource appointments power that the text of the Constitution would seem to give it. The Constitution literally says in Article 2, the recess appointments clause, power of the president. It uses the word the. The implication of the word the is there's only one recess, one official recess, and that the only time the recess appointments power kicks in is during that recess. And what the Breyer majority on the court in this case sets out doing is to make the case that the history of the nation, the history of relations between the President of the United States and the Senate of the United States throughout his history validates the fact that presidents have been consistently making recess appointments at times when the Senate was unavailable to provide its advice and its consent. And for the most part, the Senate went along with it. What Justice Breyer is doing is justifying the expansion and the adaptability of the intent, the framers' intent in the Constitution of the United States. And Justice Scalia's goal is to make that impossible by sticking to the letter of the law, so to speak, the actual language in the Constitution, as if the framers were able to look ahead 2 centuries in order to anticipate the evolution of the Recess Appointments Clause. This, I think, is the crux of the issue. But there's even more associated with Justice Scalia's opinion here. And it's this inordinate emphasis on individual freedom to the exclusion of a broader, more meaningful interpretation of government's role in this republic. We have seen all sorts of evidence here at the Virtual Center that government's principal responsibility is to promote the public interest. Many times promoting the public interest does mean coming down on the side of individual freedom against the right of government to infringe upon that freedom. But oftentimes, government's definition of the public interest at a particular point in time may not focus on that particular definition of government's principal role at all. If you accept, without question, Justice Scalia's argument that the core purpose of the Constitution of the United States is to protect individual freedom, and all of that implies at the time, which is property, which gets us into property rights and the power of the wealthy, then in effect you are buying into interpretation of the Constitution which renders the federal government of the United States as the agent of the wealthy, as the principal vehicle to contain the hopes and the aspirations and the perceived threats of the many, of the majority. I would suggest to you that government's responsibility to promote the public interest is a little bit broader than that. Government's responsibility to promote the interests of everybody, not just the few, is the product of government's job, if you will, to weigh and to balance the priorities at a particular point in time. Justice Scalia's interpretation would limit government's role always to come down on the side of individual freedom, no matter what the circumstances of the particular issue would be. And as I indicated at the end of the first hour, there is a real danger that this overbearing, inordinate, overpowering emphasis on individual liberty leads some to believe that freedom means the right to do whatever you want, and that government, the community, has no right to interfere with you as an individual at all. I would suggest to you that is a formula for chaos, anarchy. And as Madison predicted in his 1829 letter, which we looked at in previous weeks, Madison predicted and suggested that if government does that, if government is unwilling to adapt to changing circumstances and to redefine the public interest in light of changing demographic and economic, political, and social circumstances within the country, then Republican government is doomed. Because what you are doing is opening the way to anarchy. And the only way that government can deal with anarchy is military dictatorship or, Madison said, monarchy. You will lose the republic if you adhere to this rigid interpretation of the core function of government articulated by Antonin Scalia in this opinion. That, I would suggest to you, is the thrust of this particular minority decision. The bulk of Justice Scalia's position, his opinion, concurring opinion, focuses principally on the language of the Constitution, on the text, which is the basis of the doctrine of originalism, which Justice Scalia articulates so often and so well, namely that the constitutionality of the constitutionality of legislation is to be determined by the original intent of the Constitution when it was first written. In other words, the Constitution of the United States is not an adaptable, flexible document designed to meet changing circumstances through the ages in order to preserve the Republic. The priority of the Constitution is a fixed document which is intended to define and to limit and restrict the interpretation of the Constitution's meaning to what it meant to the founders at the end of the 18th century. That seems to me to become the core of what the real issue is here in this particular situation. I wanted to use this opportunity. We've just gone beyond the bottom of our second hour. It's 33 minutes past the hour. We've got about 25 minutes left in today's program. I want to go back to a very famous document in early American history, specifically to a speech delivered to the Massachusetts General a speech delivered to the Massachusetts General Court in 1645 by John Winthrop. In that particular speech, John Winthrop is raising to the General Court of Massachusetts the issue of the people's right to hold magistrates accountable to them for what they do. Winthrop's position is that while it is the people who call the magistrates to office, quote, we have our authority from God in way of an ordinance, such as hath the image of God eminently stamped upon it. The contempt and violation thereof hath been vindicated with examples of divine vengeance. Translation? John Winthrop says that while we are elected by the people, our accountability is not to them, it is to God. Our job is to implement God's law on earth. Consequently, the only object of accountability we have is accountability to God. When I covered this in class a few weeks ago in my morning class, I raised the obvious question: how do you implement the language here? How do you know what God wanted in order to be able to hold these magistrates accountable to upholding and enforcing God's law? How do we know for sure what God's law is in this particular case? The answer, of course, is that we are left with no alternative except to say that God's law is whatever these people say it is. They are justifying their right to absolute power and lack of responsibility to the people by claiming that they are ruling with God's blessing. This is not the interpretation of Republican government that any of us believe. I suggest to you that if you restrict the Constitution of the United States and the role of government under it to the preservation of individual liberty, to the exclusion of equality, to the exclusion of the responsibility to promote the public interest, to the exclusion of life and the pursuit of happiness, as well as individual liberty, as government's principal charge, then you are performing material damage on this republic. And you are, in effect, writing the epitaph that will go on the headstone of this republic when it fails. So says James Madison, who wrote the Constitution of the United States. But even focusing on the issue of liberty itself, let's assume that Scalia is right. Let's assume that it's all about liberty. Listen to what John Winthrop tells us about liberty. John Winthrop said, the other point concerning liberty, he said there are two issues disturbing the country right now. The first one is the accountability of the magistrates. We just dealt with that. The second issue is liberty, is individual freedom. Now he's addressing that second point. And Winthrop says, for the other point concerning liberty, I observe a great mistake in the country about that. There is a twofold liberty. Natural, parentheses, I mean as our nature is now corrupt, close quotes, close parentheses, and civil or federal liberty. There are two kinds of freedom. There's natural freedom, and there's civil freedom, civil liberty. The first, natural, is common to man with beasts and other creatures. By this, man, as he stands in relationship to man, simply hath liberty to do what he lists. L-I-S-T-S, lists. It is a liberty to do evil as well as to good. This liberty is incompatible and inconsistent with authority and cannot endure the least restraint of the most just authority. So Winthrop says there are two kinds of liberty. There's what he calls natural liberty, which is the right to do whatever you want. And then there's federal or civil liberty. And in looking at the first, natural liberty, Winthrop says this is the same freedom that animals have. The right to do whatever you want. And he said this kind of freedom is incompatible and inconsistent with authority. What does that mean? It means that you can't allow that kind of liberty if you hope to live in a society, in an organized society, which is what God intended us to be about. And of course, he's talking about the Puritans in Massachusetts in the 17th century who believed they were on a mission from God to set up God's ideal community. Giving people the right to do whatever they want is inconsistent with that, Winthrop says. And if you get to the reason, it's because Winthrop believed, as most Christians believe, that man was forever stained with the stain of original sin. Therefore, man's nature, man's natural inclination, is to be evil. Madison said, factions are sown into the nature of man. Man's inclination is not to cooperate and do what's right, but to look out for himself first and do whatever he wants to do, whether in fact it's consistent with the public good or not. Winthrop says, this liberty is incompatible and inconsistent with authority, and it cannot endure the least restraint of the most just authority. If you believe that you have the right to do whatever you want, then you're always going to be at odds with government, because government must always come at you and seek to limit your freedom, because government's job is to preserve the community, not your freedom. That's the first thing. Winthrop says the exercise and maintaining of this liberty makes men grow more evil and in time to be worse than brute beasts. That is the great enemy of truth and peace, that wild beast which all the ordinance of God are bent against, to restrain and subdue it. The principal responsibility of government, John Winthrop is saying, is to protect the community, the society, from the dangers of those people who believe that they have a right to do whatever they want to do. Translation, those people who will become the beneficiaries for what Antonin Scalia believes is the principal responsibility and job of government, is to protect their liberty. It is not. And you can go all the way back through, and I don't care, you can talk about Edmund Burke, you can talk about John Winthrop, you can talk about the founders or whatever. Nobody argues that freedom is the right to do whatever you want. But Justice Scalia is implying that that's government responsibility, is to allow people to make that determination. Of course, that doesn't mean that they don't enforce the law. But the freedom of people to make these decisions is the first priority. Winthrop goes on and explains the second kind of liberty, which he calls civil liberty. The other kind of liberty, he says, I call civil or federal. It may also be termed moral, in reference to the covenant between God and man, and the moral law, and the political covenants and constitutions among men themselves. The kind of liberty that is associated with civil government, with society, with organized society, is civil freedom, federal freedom. This liberty, Winthrop says, is the proper end and object of authority, and cannot subsist without it. And it is a liberty to do that only which is good, just, and honest. How do you translate that? What Winthrop is saying is that people are free to do what's right, what's legal. They are not free to do anything else. This liberty, Winthrop says, you ought to stand for, with the hazard not only of your goods, but of your lives, if need be. Whatsoever crosses this, whatever comes into contradiction with this kind of liberty, is not authority, but a distemper thereof. This liberty is maintained and exercised in a way of subjection to authority. It is the same kind of liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free. God gave us freedom to exercise maximum independence, provided we were doing it within the context of the public good. We were not infringing on the freedom of other people. We were not abusing other people. We were respecting the rights and the freedom and the equality of other people. And we developed the kind of true respect and sensitivity to the rights of other people that makes it possible for us to live together in peace and harmony. If that's what we're talking about, within that context, freedom becomes a good thing. It is the freedom to obey the law, not the freedom to violate it. It is the freedom to conform to the public interest as defined by government, whose principal responsibility is to preserve the public good. And to enforce the law in such a way that the public good always remains the number one priority. This liberty, Winthrop said, is maintained and exercised in a way of subjection to authority. It's the same kind of liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free. And listen to this. The woman's own choice, Winthrop says, makes such a man her husband. Yet being so chosen, he is her Lord, and she is to be subject to him, yet in a way of liberty, not of bondage. A true wife accounts her subjection, her honor, and her freedom, and would not think her condition safe and free, but in her subjection to her husband's authority. In other words, your freedom is directly dependent on order. Your freedom does not give you the right to turn order and peace and stability into chaos, disorder, and inhuman treatment of one person to the other. The idea of marriage, the relationship between husband and wife in a marriage, is very similar to the relationship that man has with God, Winthrop would argue. These are very, very similar. Such is the liberty of the church under the authority of Christ, her king and husband. His yoke is so easy and sweet to her as a bride's ornament. And if through forwardness or wantonness she shake it off at any time, she is at no rest in her spirit until she take it up again. What Winthrop is talking about is the meaning of freedom in the real world. Antonin Scalia is talking about an interpretation of freedom and this idealistic free enterprise capitalist world that he seeks to impose under the Constitution of the United States by claiming that that is the world that the founders intended to create. As I indicated at the top of the last hour, it seems to me that this overbearing, inordinate, unrealistic emphasis on individual freedom in today's world seems to be bordering much more closely on what John Winthrop in 1645 called natural liberty, and that in the process we are losing a sense of meaning to what Winthrop called civil liberty. Obviously, what Winthrop is saying in his distinction between these two kinds of liberty is the same thing that Alexander Hamilton is saying in the very first Federalist paper. Individual freedom is dependent on the vigor of government, not the absence of government. The absence of government, or the inability of government to govern, creates chaos. It promotes the worst kind of freedom, the kind of freedom that John Winthrop associated with animals. We cannot defend it. We have got to understand it and contain it. How many examples in our society today do we encounter of people who believe that their freedom takes precedence over my freedom? If you live next door to me, you can do anything you want with your property. You can put anything on your property you want because it's yours. And government's responsibility under Justice Scalia's Constitution is to defend your freedom to do that. Even if the exercise of your freedom infringes upon mine. My property values goes down. My health and safety is threatened by what you do within your boundaries. The only way to prevent that is to recognize that the freedom of all of us as individuals, the freedom of each one of us, depends on the freedom of all of us. And that's government's responsibility, is to define and protect that freedom and to interpret it and adapt it to the situations as they come up, to changing circumstances as they come up. That's really what we're talking about here. Because in the process of promoting the public interest, of creating community, of building within society the kind of interpersonal respect and sensitivity to each other, to our joys, to our pains, to our suffering, to our successes, to our failures, the ability to walk in the other guy's shoes and to relate to the concerns and the problems and the foibles of other people strengthens this sense of community to the point that the stronger community becomes, the more free all of us become as individuals. Because it's the kind of environment that is conducive to growth, that is conducive to increasing individual freedom. The narrow definition of freedom, which is tied to the idea that you can do whatever you want, and government's principal responsibility, to use Justice Scalia's term, core responsibility, is to protect that definition of freedom, is, James Madison predicted in 1829, the beginning of the end of this republic. All you need to do is look around at what's happening in this nation, in this world, and you begin to appreciate the challenge that all of us have before us. My definition of my God is not the same as your definition of your God. Therefore, I have the right to impose my definition upon you because I have the power to do it, and I have the charge from God to do it. My God, what are we saying? What are we doing? The fact that I have the right to attack a spouse or a child with a weapon. In the case of football players in the National Football League, their hands are weapons. I have the right to do that. Is absolutely unbelievable. In a community that was substantive and real and had meaning, where people had genuine affection for each other and respect for each other, where people, I'm thinking specifically of Francis Hutcheson here, and the Scottish Enlightenment, a world in which people defined happiness not as what I have, but rather what I can do for you. In doing for you, I am expanding my own happiness. In that kind of a world, where there was genuine respect and love, not toleration, not just your right to exist and believe what you want, but a world that was able to overcome its differences, recognizing that there are differences amongst all of us, but recognizing that in spite of that, there are things that all of us have in common and all of us are able to work together toward achieving. If they could become our priority, then I would suggest to you that parents would not abuse children, husbands would not abuse wives, and we would begin to achieve the kind of ideal community that I believe the founders genuinely were after when Alexander Hamilton basically suggested that people's liberty is the result of vigor in government, not the absence of it. So speaks Justice Scalia. So speaks the Tea Party. So speaks, on this Monday, the 15th day of September, the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution of the United States and Civic Responsibility. We're at 59 minutes after the hour. Thank you for your time. Please enjoy your evening. Be safe. And join us again tomorrow, our late program tomorrow, 1:30 p.m. in the East. We'll start 1/2 hour late. Thank you, and good evening.